Stan Grant's 2015 speech at the Ethics Centre, "Racism is Destroying Australia's Dream," has been widely acknowledged as one of the most powerful and ever heard in recent Australian history. More than 1.5 million have viewed it on YouTube. He argued that while racism is destroying the Australian dream, we're better than that. That speech led him to write his now widely acclaimed book, Talking to My Country, a very powerful and personal mediation on what it means to be Australian, what it means to be Indigenous, and what racism really means in this country. Stan is a Wiradjuri man, a journalist since 1987. He has worked for the ABC, SBS and the 7 Network, and since 2013 he's the international editor for Sky News. He also spent many years outside of Australia working in Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Africa, a time that liberated him and gave him this unique perspective on Australia. From 2001 to 2012, he worked for CNN as the anchor in Hong Kong before relocating to Beijing as a correspondent. Stan Grant's festival appearance is sponsored by CQ Uni, Office of Indigenous Engagement. This provides teaching, research and support activities to improve outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and our communities. In addition to teaching, enabling an undergraduate and most important postgraduate courses that increase knowledge and understanding of our history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the issues affecting them in a contemporary society. The Office of Indigenous Engagement provides support to other schools and within CQ University to increase the accessibility to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Folks, could you please give a warm guri and a big warm welcome to Mr. Stan Grant.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thanks, David. I could just let David speak. I could hear him all day. David was talking about my country, Wiradjuri country, and I want to just speak the language of our country. Badadu Wiradjuri Gibia, Dira Madalinya, Badu Wiradjuri, Nadi Wongama. I am a Wiradjuri man, a proud Wiradjuri man. My family's name is Wongama. Wongama was a man who was born into this country before the coming of white people. A man that I can trace my ancestry back to a point at the Balabula River just outside of Cowra, where he would have seen the first white people who came to this country. I'm descended directly from Wongama on my father's side. Nadu Yinjamari, Mayanji Ninagare Niani Buagalingura, Ninayiradu. I want to also pay my respects to the traditional people here, and on this day, a fantastic day and at a fantastic place that we can truly meet here as one people, as Australian people sharing this country. I just heard David speak there about catching the train and stopping at Cootamundra. Cootamundra, Temora, West Wyalong, Griffith, Narandra, Leeton, Albury, Wagga. These are the towns of my childhood, but these are towns that sit on a land that I'm connected to so deeply. And it's in these towns that our histories are written. Cootamundra. Cootamundra was the town where they established a girls' home. This was in the late part of the 1800s into the early part of the 1900s. It's remained open right up until the 1970s. And here was a home where Aboriginal girls were taken from all over Australia and sent to. Among them was my great aunt, my grandfather's sister. She was signed into the Cootamundra Girls' Home by the manager of the Aboriginal station at Cowra. When she went to the Cootamundra Girls' Home, she lost her name and was given a number. Her number was number 658. As number 658, she lived alongside other girls who were being trained to be white, who were told that what they were was not good enough. I went back to that girls' home just recently, and walking through there, I could sense still the presence of those girls. I stood under a window where my great aunt was photographed. In this photograph you can see all the girls lined up along the wall. And right in the middle, standing under a window, was my great aunt Eunice Grant. All the girls are just staring ahead, no one's smiling, just a blank look on their faces. Number 658 would have lived in a dormitory where there was a sign on the wall, and the sign read, "Think white, act white, be white." Think white, act white, be white. Eventually she was sent to work for wealthy squatter families in outback New South Wales. She was trained as a domestic servant. Eventually she found her way back to her own people, but she had to apply for permission from the state to be able to live on the mission where my grandfather, her brother, lived. She had to apply for permission to marry the man that she loved. Every aspect of her life was governed by that number 658. She lost her identity, she lost her name, and she was told that what she was wasn't good enough. She died at the age of 36 from a heart condition caused by rheumatic fever that she contracted in that girl's home. She left behind 6 young children, orphan children, to live in a world where they carried the weight of her history, the history that is still not really spoken in our country. These are common stories to us. It's these stories that give us the sense of who we are. Just one of so many stories that are typical for our people. All of our people share these stories. We share the stories of children taken, of land lost, of languages silenced, of culture destroyed, people who were told where they could live, people who were told who they could marry. I want to be able to speak today about what it is to try to write about Indigenous affairs, to influence all Australians. And it begins with those stories. It begins with reclaiming those stories. I recall the words of the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur. And he said, "We must remember because remembering is a moral duty. We owe a debt to the victims. By remembering and telling, we stop them from being buried twice." We stop them from being buried twice. Being able to speak of my great aunt, Eunice Grant, stops her from being buried twice in a country where her history and her identity were being buried. I recall also the story of a man named Frank Foster. Frank Foster is a name that appears very briefly in my family, a man that I've been searching for all my life. Frank Foster was born around the south coast of New South Wales in the 1800s. He was rounded up and sent to an Aboriginal mission on the banks of the Murray River, eventually being sent to another mission at Warringezda on the banks of the Murrumbidgee. There he met a woman called Lydia Naden, another Aboriginal woman on that mission, and they had a child. Her name was Florence Foster. Florence Foster was my great-grandmother. But Frank Foster was this elusive figure, someone I had a name for but could never quite place. We are Wiradjuri people on my father's side, Gomeroi people on my mother's side. The Wiradjuri story was always told to me. We grew up on Wiradjuri country. I knew my Wiradjuri ancestry. But Frank Foster didn't fit into that story. He came from somewhere else. Frank Foster was forced off the mission, separated from his wife and child, never to see them again, banished to wander New South Wales. I looked for him in the official records, and occasionally I'd catch a glimpse of him. There'd be a line about him in a mission record or a report by the Aborigines Protection Board. But he remained a figure that was just out of reach. Until last week. And this is a story that really speaks to our sense of connection to our place. Just last week I bumped into a young guy, he's only in his early 30s. I see him around a lot, and we were training at the gym, the National Centre for Indigenous Excellence in Sydney. It's a place I like to go, not just to try to stay fit, but a place I go to see my own people, just to be at home among my own people, to look into the eyes of people and know that I belong, to see that smile, that little moment of recognition, to feel at home in the world, that these are people who understand me and I understand them. With a word unspoken, we know that we belong to each other. And I've seen this young boy around a lot, and occasionally we'll wave and nod and just go about our business. But on this day I stopped and we chatted. He told me about his family. He grew up in La Perouse in Sydney, the place of first contact with Captain Cook. The people who were living there traced their ancestry back to that first contact. He told me about his pride in growing up in his community and what he has done in his life to overcome the struggles that he and his family has faced. Young man, he lived on the streets for many years. Abandoned at the age of 15, turned to drink and alcohol and drugs, a little bit of trouble with the police, but eventually found himself and found his place in life. He's now completing a degree in accounting at university. And we talked about our families and our histories, and I mentioned to him that there was a figure in my family that I've never been able to find. His name was Frank Foster, and his eyes lit up. And he said, I know him. I know this man. He said, we've been doing a timeline of the people of La Perouse, going back as far as we can through all of the records. The people of La Perouse, their song lines hug the coast of New South Wales, from the south coast up to the Sydney Basin of Botany Bay. They'd intermarried over generations, never moving inland, but keeping their families along that coastal fringe. And he said, Frank Foster is an important man in our lineage. He said, I have something that I think you're going to like. That afternoon, he sent me an email, and here was the man I'd been searching for. Frank Foster was born actually in Sydney in the late 1860s. In the 1870s, he and his family were living at Circular Quay, huddled against the harbour, living in a so-called blacks camp. Well, I know this because there was a newspaper article about the death of his father. His father was also named Frank. The article said that an Aboriginal man named Frank Foster had passed away visiting an Aboriginal camp at Double Bay. He'd been left unattended for days. No one had come to collect his body. No doctor had attended him. And that now they'd called an inquest into his death. As a result of that inquest, and horrified at the treatment that was happening to Aboriginal people, they established the Aborigines Protection Board in 1883. As a result of that, losing his father, Frank, his mother and his two sisters were rounded up from Sydney and sent to an Aboriginal mission on the Murray River, eventually on to Warringesta. But I found out something else. My father had always told me that Frank Foster was a school teacher. They always called him the school teacher. And it never made sense to me because that wasn't the role for our people. Our people were lucky to be educated at all. But here, in the records that this young man had sent me, was the report from the mission manager at Malaga on the Murray River. And it spoke of Frank Foster, this intelligent half-caste, they called him, who was being trained to read and write, and eventually trained to teach other Aboriginal students, other Aboriginal kids at the mission. When his mother died, the records traced Frank's movements back up to the Shoalhaven area of South Coast, where a couple of white people had set up a bark hut school to teach Aboriginal students, and Frank had gone to help them and to teach Aboriginal kids. There was a report from the New South Wales Department of Education observing one of Frank's lessons, saying how he carried out a perfectly satisfactory lesson in arithmetic and subtraction. But eventually that school was shut down. Frank was sent out to another mission. His life after that was a life of disappointment, a life of thwarted ambition, a life controlled by the state, forced off missions, told where he could live, separated from his wife and child. Eventually, he married again, had another child. That wife died, he married again. He had several more children. Eventually, Frank found himself living on the south coast of New South Wales at a mission called Roseby Park. And there he lived until 1941. Passed away at 1941, and his death was recorded in the mission records. Described him as a well-respected and well-known man, but a phrase that really intrigued me and saddened me. It said he was a great sufferer. That Frank Foster had suffered throughout his life. He's buried in the cemetery at Berry on the New South Wales south coast. This man whose life reaches back to the fringes of the new nation, born before Australia had become a nation, holding on to the remnants of their culture and their society, separated from family, separated from culture, and leaving his bloodline in me. I found out that Frank Foster and his father are descended directly from a man who was there when Captain Cook first arrived in Australia. It gave me a great sense of pride to know that my family stood there on that land that day, that my bloodline stretches back to that moment when our lives changed forever. It didn't just give me a sense of who I was. It didn't just fill in a blank in my family tree. It told me something else. It told me that we live in two Australias. We live in a modern Australia that's been constructed around 200 plus years of settlement. But we live in an Australia that reaches back tens of thousands of years. By seeing a man in a gym in Sydney and having a conversation, we could trace our song lines, our stories, to a point before a white man had ever come to this country. That those stories are alive, those stories are who we are. And this is the challenge for me as a storyteller. It's the challenge for us as a country. How do we find a place where those stories can meet? How do non-Indigenous people connect to our traditions, our sense of antiquity, our history? And how do we find a place in an Australia that has always excluded us? How do we find a place in an Australia that has told us that we need to forget our history? My work is about trying to rescue the memories of my great aunt Eunice Grant, of people like Frank Foster, my great-great-grandfather, of being able to give voice to them so that they are not buried twice. But we are dealing here in the areas of history and memory. History and memory that are so contested and disputed, that can so easily be politicised. The German philosopher Karl Loeth said, "To ask earnestly the question of the ultimate meaning of history is to take one's breath away." To take one's breath away. Another historian, Timothy Garton Ash, once said that to live without memories is to live as a child. For a nation to live without memory is to live as a childish nation. And in Australia, we still live without memory. We still live without the stories told of what happened to our people. I was born in 1963, born into a Wiradjuri family on my father's side and a Gummelroy family on my mother's side. We spent our lives living at the coalface of Australian bigotry and poverty. We were poor and we were homeless. I think as David described, his life living under the Act. I was born before we were counted in the census. Like David, we were counted among the flora and fauna. My life was spent on the road, moving from town to town. I counted 13 or 14 different schools before I'd even entered my teens. Often I didn't go to school. We were homeless. Home was wherever we could find it, sometimes the back of a car, sometimes a caravan, a sawmill shack when my father had work. Always looking for a place to belong, a way into a society that didn't accept us. We were living in what the Australian anthropologist Bill Stanner once described as the Great Australian Silence. This deathly silence that wrote us out of their history. I remember going to school as a young boy and having to recite the oath, the Pledge of Allegiance. Some of you at my age may remember this, but you would stand in the playground and you would have to honour my God, serve my Queen and salute the flag. And I remember at the age of 5 or 6 feeling that this didn't speak to me. I don't know what it was, but even at that age I knew this wasn't my story. Because I would go home at the end of that day and I would see where this flag had placed us. How could I salute a flag when I know that that flag didn't include me? We weren't counted among the people represented by that flag. When Australia was federated in 1901, it was believed that we would die out, that the pillow was being smoothed for our eventual extinction. When we didn't die out, it was believed that we would be absorbed into the Commonwealth, absorbed, that we would lose all trace of who we were. I remember telling my grandfather, I don't feel as if I want to salute that flag. He said, what you have to do is cross your fingers and put them behind your back. That way you won't mean it. I remember going with my grandfather to the local cinema. These were the days before Charles Perkins had led the freedom rides to destroy segregation in outback New South Wales. These were the days when Aboriginal people couldn't sit in the same part of the cinema or swim in the swimming pool. I remember sitting in a little roped-off section of the cinema and they would play the national anthem and everyone would have to stand. My grandfather would get me and hold me down and say, no, we don't stand for this. Just those little moments of protest, those little moments that connected me to my sense of who I was, reclaiming our stories out of the great Australian silence. The French historian Vladimir Franklevitch also speaks of this. He speaks of what he called a shameful amnesia. A shameful amnesia. In this way, we didn't hear about the frontier wars. We didn't hear about the massacres, the poisonings, the rounding up of people and forcing onto missions. At school, I was told of the peaceful settlement of Australia. I was told that Captain Cook discovered Australia. I was told that Blackstone, Lawson and Wentworth crossed the Blue Mountains. But I was never told that my people were waiting on the other side of those mountains. I was never told about the great bloodletting of Bathurst in the 1820s, the war for Bathurst. If you go to the Sydney Gazette, you can see the reporting of that conflict still today. A conflict at the time described as an exterminating war. At the time, martial law was declared, legally sanctioned violence against the Wiradjuri people. Within a matter of years, half the Wiradjuri population was wiped out. Disease and death, the gun, poisonings, half the population wiped out. And I was born out of the remnants of that society, the people who clung together, huddled together on those missions, regrouping, finding ourselves in new names, not the names of our ancestors, but the names of the settlers. As we took the settlers' names, as our skin became lighter, we found a new sense of ourselves as Wiradjuri people who would not die out. Trying to keep those stories alive, trying to keep those traditions alive, were what gave me a sense of myself. I didn't have a classic education growing up. Moving around from town to town, often months would go by without going to school. But I got a different education. I got an education in who I was and where I belonged. As we would travel New South Wales, my father would point out different parts of the country. He'd tell me what was our country, what that rock meant, what that tree meant, what this river meant. He told me the stories of what happened there. My mother told me the stories of her father and her mother. Her mother, a white Australian who crossed the colour line of the 1930s and endured abuse, who was ostracised from her own people, who couldn't go to hospital to have her first child because they wouldn't accept her. A woman who would have her pram upturned in the street searching for alcohol because they suspected she was taking alcohol back to the blacks. She told me about her father, my grandfather, arrested from his bed, accused of drinking and then tied to a tree like a dog so that his children would see as they walked past to school. These stories gave me a sense of who I was. My mother used to write poetry and short stories. She'd tell stories about living in the humpies on the fringes of town. She'd tell stories about the food they ate, about living as an Aboriginal person. She told me stories about the welfare, about people who would come and try to take you away. These stories warned me. The British poet Wilfred Owen said that it is the poet's duty to warn, to be able to guard against history. And my mother warned me about the society that I was being born into. When I came to write my book, Talking to My Country, I took my youngest son back to our country. I sat down by a creek bed and I told him the story of what happened there. The creek today is named Poison Waterhole Creek. He crosses that creek every time he goes to visit his grandparents. But on this day I stopped and I told him the story of how the people there were poisoned, how they died on the banks of that creek, of how others, seeing what happened, fled to an island in the middle of the Wiradjuri River and were shot. Today that island is known as Murdering Island. When I go home, I cross Poison Waterholes Creek. When I swim in the Wiradjuri, I can swim out to Murdering Island. We often hear people say, but I didn't know. Why weren't we told? But it's all around us. The reminders and the stories are all around us. The settlers named the creek after what they'd done. They named Poison Waterhole Creek. They named Murdering Island. And we live with the memory of that. The Polish poet Czesław Miłosz once said that perhaps all memory is the memory of wounds. He was speaking of the Jewish experience. The philosopher Hegel spoke of the miseries of memory. The miseries of memory. Every time I go home, we live with the memory of wounds and the miseries of memory. I was back home just a couple of weeks ago and my father and I were watching the television news. And we saw people going to Fromelles and Pozières in France to commemorate the fallen Australian soldiers, to lay wreaths at white crosses, to reclaim that lost sense of themselves, to commemorate their history, to feel a connection and a pride to who they are. My father's uncle lies on those fields. an Aboriginal man who signed up to fight a war for a country that didn't recognise him as a citizen. And he wasn't alone. But my father said, why can they go to France and commemorate their dead, and we can't lay wreaths at Murdering Island or Poison Waterhole Creek? Why are we told to forget our history while each year they say, lest we forget? Here is the divide between us. When we come to speak of our history, when we come to speak of our place in this country, we rub up against the history that is remembered and the history we are told to forget. When I came to write Talking to My Country, it was after spending many years away. I was fortunate to find a life for myself in journalism. Journalism was my salvation. A boy who had grown up listening to the stories of my people, raised on the stories of my mother and my father, in love with books. Everything I could get my hands on, I read. I found myself in a profession that allowed me to tell stories, that took me to more than 70 countries, that allowed me to live in at least half a dozen countries. I spent 17 years reporting away from Australia. I lived in the UK. I lived in Hong Kong and Beijing, Abu Dhabi and Dubai, Islamabad, Kabul, Baghdad. And when I reported these stories, I saw a world changing around me. I saw people living with uncertainty, people living with conflict. I saw people trying to live lives of dignity and meaning. And I saw people living with the memories of wounds. When a Chinese person speaks of the 100 years of humiliation, they're speaking of the memory of wounds, of the memory of oppression by foreign powers. When I met a man in Baghdad, a Palestinian man, who had fled his home at the establishment of the State of Israel, what the Palestinians called the Nakba, the catastrophe. And he'd fled to Baghdad only for war to follow him and find him there. He brought out a little jar of dirt. He put it in my hand and he said, "This is my home." Dirt from the home that he'd fled, that he carried with him. His memory of wounds. When I looked into the eyes of a refugee in Pakistan or Afghanistan, I saw the eyes of my father. I saw the eyes of my cousins and uncles. When I reported these stories, I felt as if I was telling the history of my people too. The history of our people is the history of people the world over, struggling against oppression, struggling against violence, and holding on to that sense of who we are. Kierkegaard, the philosopher, once said that life can only be lived forward, but can only be understood backwards. When I came back to Australia 2.5 years ago, I came back to a country that was still trapped in its history. That to understand my life, I had to look backwards. I came back to a country where an AFL player, an Australian of the Year, could be booed, humiliated out of the game that he loved. When I saw what happened to Adam Goodes, I heard what I described at the time as a howl of humiliation. A howl that was so familiar to us. The howl that came from dispossession and suffering and injustice. The howl of exclusion, the howl that told us that we didn't belong. I wrote at the time that I couldn't explain what lay in the head or the hearts of people who booed Adam Goodes. But I could say what it felt like for us. What it felt like. The African-American writer James Baldwin says it's not enough to simply tell people the facts. People must feel the facts. That people must know what it is like for us in Australia. As Paul Keating said in his Redfern speech of 1992, when he spoke about the dispossession and the children taken and the massacres, he said we have to be able to imagine what it would feel like if that was done to us. I was reminded of that again just these recent weeks when I saw those images on our television screen of the boys in the prisons in the Northern Territory. I watched that program that night with my 19-year-old son, a boy who has led a privileged life, a boy who has been fortunate enough to have escaped the worst of what has happened to his people. And as we watched that, I saw him lose his place in the world. All of the certainty, all the things that he'd been led to believe, that he'd grown up to believe in, vanished. What he saw on that screen were boys who looked like him, who were him. And he wondered, is this my country? And this is a question that we ask ourselves all the time. Is this our country? When we see people laying wreaths to commemorate the Anzacs, but we can't lay wreaths to commemorate those people who fell defending our country in our name. It is a difficult thing when we talk about history and memory. If indeed a person without memory is a child, and a nation without memory is likely to be childish, it's also true that memory and history can be politicised. It's also true that memory can trump history, that memory can be selective, that what we choose to remember can divide us as much as it can unite us. Ernst Renan, a French historian, said, "Nations are founded on a rich legacy of memories, but forgetting too is an essential factor in the creation of nations." So when I come to these stories, when I came to write my book, when I look at the situation that we're in Australia, I ask myself, what are we prepared to forget? To reconcile, how do we forget? And can we forget until we have remembered? Who chooses what we remember? And who chooses what we forget? The Jewish writer Avishai Margalit talks about a community of memory, that we have to share the memories. It doesn't belong to me. It is not just my story, but it is our story. What happened in this country is our story. The first footprints 60,000 years ago are our story. The story of Mungo Man, a skeleton discovered in a dry lake bed in Western New South Wales, the oldest human remains ever found in this country. More than 40,000 years old. The first evidence anywhere in the world of ceremonial burial. Placed in the ground, his arms folded, his body smeared in ochre. This was an important man, and he was buried with ceremony before anyone else on earth had done this. This is our story. The story of the coming of the British is our story. It has shaped our lives as surely as those first footprints. The story of the frontier violence is our story. I'm born out of that, and everyone here is shaped by that. It isn't about shame or guilt or blame. It is about truth. But who chooses the truth? The truth is more often about power than it is about truth. It is about the power to select what matters. It is about the power to say, lest we forget, and why don't you forget? Avishai Margalit said that there is a biased salience. Events from the so-called First World are likely to be more salient than comparable events in the Third World. That the I think we know this as the phrase that the winners write history. And sadly for us, we've been on the losing end. But we're seeing this now. We're starting to see Aboriginal writers challenging this, writing our stories, demanding to be heard, demanding to speak of our history as proudly as Australians can speak of their history. If the stories of the explorers, if the stories of Cook, the stories of Captain Phillip, if the stories of Gallipoli and Anzac are important, then so are our stories. We're starting to pierce that great Australian silence, and slowly, Australians are opening their ears. They want to know about these stories. They want to know what it is to belong in a country and truly feel that they belong in this country. It's difficult when we approach the telling of these stories because we come from a position of powerlessness. We come from a position where we're invisible. We are shaped by terra nullius, the belief that we were not here, that this was an empty land, a land free for the taking. We search to be visible. We search to live lives free of what Black American writers have called the white gaze. Toni Morrison, a Nobel laureate writer, says, "Our lives have no meaning, no depth without the white gaze. Just as I have spent my entire writing life trying to make sure that the white gaze was not the dominant one in any of my books." And that is our struggle. The struggle for our lives is to live lives free of the white gaze, of being able to speak of our history and find connections. Speak about history not to shut us down but to open us up. To be able to find a place for all of us in this country. I gave that speech at the Ethics Centre just last year. I had no idea what was likely to happen. I could never have anticipated the response to that. I spoke from my heart. I didn't speak from notes. I wanted to speak directly to that experience. I wanted to feel my people with me. As I said at the time, if I stood on the other side, I would speak as proudly as anyone for Australia. But I stood on the side of my ancestors, and Australia looked very different from where we sat. But I also said that we are better than that. The people in this room today tell us that we're better than that. The people who have marched for reconciliation, shed tears with us at the apology to the stolen generations, they've told us that we are better. And I have to believe that we are better. I have to believe, as Martin Luther King said, that the arc of history bends towards justice, that justice will triumph, and that a great country like Australia can live up to the full meaning of that greatness, that we don't have to be divided by our history, that we don't have to use history as a weapon, that our stories can share this space as surely as we physically share this space. I finished that speech by talking about the Australian anthem, how the anthem of being young and free doesn't speak to a people who die young, doesn't speak to a people who are locked up in the numbers that we are in our prisons. But I said, I hope for the day when I can stand on a stage and sing as loudly and as proudly as anyone else, Australians all, let us rejoice. Thank you.